Napoleon's Egyptian adventure. The greatest gamble in history, right? Picture this for a moment. You're sat in a floating fortress, surrounded by the Mediterranean's crystal blue waters, commanding over 55,000 soldiers, crammed into 300 ships. The year 1798. And you've just made what might be the most audacious decision in military history. You're about to invade Egypt, not for gold, not for glory alone, but because you reckon you can literally change the course of world history with one brilliant stroke. Mental right. That's exactly where we find ourselves with Napoleon Bonaparte, the cocky French general who'd already turned Europe upside down, now setting his sights on something even more extraordinary. And blimey, what a story this turns out to be. Now, before we dive headfirst into this epic tale of ambition, betrayal, and sheer bloody-minded determination, let me ask you something. Have you ever made a decision so bold, so completely barmy, that everyone around you thought you'd lost your marbles? Well, multiply that feeling by about 1,000,000, and you're starting to get close to what Napoleon was feeling as his massive invasion fleet cut through Mediterranean waters in May 1798. See, this wasn't just any old military campaign. This was the kind of move that could either crown you as the greatest military genius who ever lived, or see you buried in the desert sands, forgotten by history. No pressure, then. The thing is, Napoleon didn't just wake up one morning and think, fancy a trip to Egypt today. Oh no, this was all part of a much bigger game. A deadly chess match being played across Europe, with Britain as France's last standing opponent after 6 grueling years of revolutionary warfare. Picture the scene in Paris. The Directory France's rather dodgy government at the time were absolutely chuffing themselves over this plan. They saw 2 massive wins coming their way. First, they'd deal a crushing blow to British trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, potentially severing Britain's lifeline to India and the East. Those profitable trading networks were basically funding Britain's war effort, so cut them off and Bob's your uncle Britain's stuffed. But here's where it gets proper interesting. The Directory had a second, rather sneaky motive. They wanted this ambitious, alarmingly popular General Bonaparte as far away from Paris as humanly possible. You see, coups and political backstabbing were practically the national sport in revolutionary France, and Napoleon was making them decidedly nervous with his growing influence and swagger. For Napoleon himself, though, this expedition was like Christmas morning. He'd been instrumental in planning and promoting this whole venture, seeing it as his golden ticket to even greater glory. The man genuinely saw himself following in the footsteps of his heroes, Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. And just like Alexander, Napoleon had these absolutely bonkers ideas about marching all the way to India to have a proper go at the British there. Now, Dumas deserves a moment in the spotlight. He was France's first black general, born in what is now Haiti to a French aristocrat and an enslaved African woman. The man had already earned legendary status during the Italian campaigns, where the Austrians had nicknamed him the Black Devil. Imagine facing that across a battlefield. The expedition also included familiar faces from Italy: Napoleon's tireless chief of staff, General Berthier, and brigade commanders Generals Murat, Lance, and Marmont. But here's what made this expedition truly special. Napoleon had also brought along 167 scientists, scholars, artists, and experts of every description. They even packed a balloony, collectively known as the Savines. They'd come to study Egypt's historical and natural wonders. However, Reality has a way of puncturing even the grandest dreams. Alexandria, that legendary city founded by Alexander himself, turned out to be a bitter disappointment. Centuries of earthquakes and neglect had reduced this once magnificent metropolis to a crumbling town of just 6,000 inhabitants. Not exactly the glorious gateway to the Orient they'd been expecting. Egypt was nominally ruled by the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, power belonged to the local Mamluk commanders, particularly to men, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey. The Mamluks had originally been slave soldiers serving the Islamic Caliph, brilliant horsemen and fearless warriors. They now ruled Egypt with an iron fist, stripping away its wealth whilst leaving the peasants in grinding poverty. For most Egyptians, the Mamluks were despised foreign oppressors, a situation Napoleon hoped to exploit with some clever propaganda. To the people of Egypt, he proclaimed, "I have come to restore your rights and punish the usurper. I respect God, His Prophet, and the Quran." Meanwhile, Murad and Ibrahim were rallying Mamluk commanders at the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo. Here, they agreed to gather an army to crush the invaders. Napoleon believed his best bet was to strike fast and hard. Less than a day after his troops finished landing, he began his advance on Cairo. But this is where things started going proper. Pear-shaped. ... He'd completely underestimated the blistering climate and the harsh, windswept terrain, pushing a punishing pace even after his men ran out of water and were consumed by thirst. Napoleon drove them mercilessly forward. Hundreds collapsed and died. Some, driven to desperation, took their own lives rather than endure the suffering. Bedouin horsemen circled the French like vultures, picking off stragglers who were robbed, tortured, and killed. Even old comrades like Lannes and Mourag got into heated arguments about Napoleon's decisions. It took the army for agonizing days to cover just 45 miles to Damanar, where they could finally rest, drink, and trade for food. But there was no time to properly recover. Word arrived that a large Mamluk force under Murad Bey was approaching from the southeast. The French advanced to meet them at Shubrakit, on the banks of the Nile. As 4,000 Mamluk horsemen came into view, the French couldn't help but marvel at their brilliant colored robes decorated with gold and jewels, and their numerous ornate weapons, including pistols, swords, daggers, and lances. Murad boasted that he would cut off French heads like melons in a field. But for all their courage and flair, the Mamluks lacked the discipline and tactics to deal with a trained, modern army. When Napoleon formed his troops into massive squares, the Mamluk cavalry could only circle impotently, unable to break through the walls of French bayonets. Volley after volley crashed into their ranks. After 2 hours, the Mamluks broke off their attack and retreated. They'd suffered around 1,000 casualties. The French had barely lost a man. The victory was a desperately needed morale boost for Napoleon's men after the hardships of the desert march. But this was just the opening act. The Mamluks fell back to Mbaba, a small town on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Cairo. Here, within sight of Egypt's fantastic pyramids 9 miles to the south, they would face the invader with their full strength. On the sweltering afternoon of the 21st of July, Napoleon's forces approached Mbaba. He had 25,000 men organized into 5 massive divisional squares, with cavalry and baggage inside and cannon at each corner. Murad, with characteristic boldness, had crossed to the west bank of the Nile, leaving Ibrahim behind. Their combined forces totaled several thousand, though sources disagree wildly on exact numbers. Murad's elite Mamluk cavalry, 6,000 strong, was positioned between the small village of Biktal and the well-fortified town of Mbaba. which was garrisoned by a mix of Ottoman infantry and village militia. Napoleon's plan was brutally simple: punch through the enemy center and crush the right wing against the river. At 3:30 p.m., the divisions of Desaix and Rainier began their advance. But as they moved across broken ground, their formation became ragged. Murad spotted his chance and unleashed his cavalry. The Mamluks thundered forward at lightning speed. Desaix and Rainier reacted just in time, closing their ranks. The French held their fire until the last possible moment, then unleashed a devastating volley. Horses and riders went tumbling. The survivors had no way to close with the enemy, who continued pouring deadly fire into their midst. The Mamluk charge collapsed, but more attacks achieved the same result. Many Mamluks simply gave up and fled the field. Napoleon ordered the divisions of Beaune and Vile to advance. Once again, Mamluk cavalry charged. Once again, the wave of horsemen broke against French muskets and bayonets. With the enemy cavalry broken, Beaune and Vile's men poured into Mbaba. It was a slaughter. Those who weren't killed fled into the Nile, where hundreds drowned. Murad Bey escaped with the remnants of his cavalry to Giza, from where he would retreat into Upper Egypt. Ibrahim Bey watched the disaster unfold across the river, then withdrew with his men to Cairo. It was a crushing, one-sided victory lasting just 2 hours. The Mamluks suffered over 5,000 casualties, with heavy losses among their elite cavalry and leadership. French losses were fewer than 300, mostly wounded. Napoleon, with his usual flair for PR, decided this great victory should be known as the Battle of the Pyramids, with the monuments looming to the south. On the 24th of July, Napoleon entered Cairo. Parts of the city were abandoned and in ruins, burnt by the Mamluks in their furious retreat. Napoleon observed, it would be difficult to find richer soil or a more miserable, ignorant, and brutalized people. Nevertheless, Cairo was the heart of Egypt, a city of 600,000 inhabitants, and it was in French hands. With the Mamluks scattered and on the run, Napoleon's dream of eastern conquest seemed within reach. Just 8 days later, that dream would be shattered. At sea, Nelson and the British Mediterranean Squadron hadn't given up their hunt for the French fleet. Finally, on the afternoon of the 1st of August, Nelson found the French anchored in Aboukir Bay. With 14 ships of the line against 13, he decided to attack that evening. The British won a complete and stunning victory. The giant French ship L'Orient was destroyed by a massive explosion. By the time it was over, the British had destroyed or captured 11 French ships of the line and taken over 3,000 prisoners. Without a fleet, Napoleon was trapped in Egypt. Even worse, most of his army's money had gone down with L'Orient. But Napoleon didn't despair. If anything, he was energized by the crisis. His options were now simple. He and his army must make their stand in this foreign land, or die trying. While General Desaix was sent south in pursuit of Murad Bey, Napoleon began reforming Egypt's administration. The old feudal system was abolished, a postal service was established, hospitals built, and a new tax system introduced. Napoleon founded the Institute of Egypt for scientific and scholarly research. He showed great interest in and respect for Islam, funding mosque construction and encouraging observance of religious festivals. Such engagement later led to rumors that Napoleon actually converted to Islam. But this was purely tactical, designed to win local favor. Napoleon also had to cope with news that his wife Josephine had resumed her affair with a former lover. It was, he was told, common knowledge among Parisian society. He consoled himself with his work, including an affair with an officer's wife. All the while, French efforts to win over the local population were failing. most Egyptians saw only foreign, godless invaders. The situation was already at boiling point. Small revolts broke out across the Nile Delta, brutally suppressed by the French. Then, in September, Sultan Selim III in Constantinople declared holy war against the French. Now, the situation in Egypt was about to explode. Cairo, the 21st of October, 1798. General Dupai, the military governor of Cairo, was called out to break up a riot. He found locals erecting barricades, was set upon, and killed. Soon, the entire city was up in arms. The French fought with ruthless discipline and crushed the revolt. Around 300 French soldiers were killed, along with several thousand Egyptians. Napoleon publicly pardoned the ringleaders, whilst quietly telling Berthier that any chief caught with a weapon should have his head cut off and thrown in the Nile. The French had bloodily restored control in Cairo, but it was clear that Napoleon would never win Egyptian hearts and minds. In the months that followed, the French were rotting away in Cairo. There was limited communication with France, much homesickness, and dwindling supplies of shops, ammunition, and wine. There was also an outbreak of bubonic plague, which tormented the army and further thinned its ranks. The only action was in the south, where General de Saix's column of 2,800 men pursued Murad Bey deep into Upper Egypt. In this epic chase, one officer stood out, a kurang 28-year-old cavalry brigadier, named Louis Nicolas Devout. On the 22nd of January 1799, he and de Saix inflicted a heavy defeat on Murad Bey, scattering his remaining forces. Murad himself escaped and remained at large, but such military victories did little to change the outlook for Napoleon's expedition. They remained 1,600 miles from France, with no prospect of reinforcements or returning home. Napoleon briefly placed his hopes in a diplomatic solution. France's foreign minister, the brilliant, urbane, and slippery Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, had been an early supporter of the Egyptian expedition. He had assured Napoleon that he would personally travel to Constantinople to smooth relations with the Sultan and secure Egypt for France. But Talleyrand never left Paris. The Sultan remained furious at France's attack on his Egyptian province. There would be no negotiations, no compromise. Orders had gone out to every corner of the Ottoman Empire to gather troops to expel the French invader. Napoleon's position seemed more desperate than ever. His troops cut off, ravaged by disease, amidst a hostile population. He would respond in the way that seemed obvious to him, as it would have to his hero Alexander. He would attack. The forces gathering in Syria, rumored to be 50,000 strong, posed the greatest threat. So, they would be his first target. On the 10th of February, Napoleon led a force of just 13,000 men into the Sinai Desert, bound for the Holy Land. It was all the men he could spare, with so many needed to keep Egypt under control. Nevertheless, it was a highly motivated, experienced, and well-led force organized into 4 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade commanded by Murat. For Napoleon's speed and surprise were essential. But things started going badly very quickly. Once again, the French were poorly prepared for the harsh conditions and desert heat. Water was scarce. Food was short. At El Arish, they unexpectedly found the town garrisoned by 3,000 Ottoman soldiers. The siege kept Napoleon stuck for 11 days and cost 400 casualties he couldn't afford. The garrison's surrender was secured only with generous terms. They were disarmed but allowed to leave. Having sworn not to take up arms against the French for a year, the French army continued into Palestine. Its fertile fields and fruit trees, a relief after the desert. On the 24th of February, the French occupied Gaza, where they were pleased to find large stores of food and ammunition abandoned. by the Ottomans. Napoleon's next target was the port city of Jaffa, held by 5,000 Ottoman soldiers. His siege guns blasted breaches in its stone walls until finally a breach was made. But when Napoleon sent a herald to invite surrender, to spare both sides the horrors of an assault, the Ottomans cut off his head and displayed it from the city walls. Enraged French soldiers stormed the breach and overwhelmed the defenders. They then poured into the city, beginning a 24-hour orgy of killing. "The sights were terrible," wrote one French witness. "The sounds of gunshots, the cries of women and fathers, piles of bodies, the smell of blood, the shouts of victors fighting over plunder." The butchery was indiscriminate. Women and children were massacred alongside 2,000 Ottoman soldiers. The next day, order was gradually restored, but more horror was to come. After Jaffa's capture, Napoleon found himself with 3,000 Ottoman prisoners who had been promised their lives. But with his troops and supplies already stretched thin, he was reluctant to spare anyone to guard or feed these unwanted captives. Moreover, some were from the Alorish garrison and had broken their oath not to take arms against the French, and they had beheaded his herald. After consulting with his officers, Napoleon gave the order to execute the prisoners. For 3 days, the French marched prisoners in groups to the beach and slaughtered them. Some were shot, some were simply driven into the sea. And by the 3rd day, French troops were ordered to use bayonets to save their ammunition. It was an atrocity Napoleon would defend for the rest of his life. "I had no other choice," he insisted years later. But the massacres provided easy propaganda for his enemies, whilst if the aim was to terrorize his foes, it seemed only to encourage them to fight harder. As if by divine judgment, within days, hundreds of French soldiers fell ill with bubonic plague. Napoleon showed considerable bravery by visiting the sick in hospital, an act later celebrated by his propaganda machine. Napoleon now headed for his main objective, Acre. The ancient port city, famous for its role in the Crusades, was now the seat of the local Ottoman governor. This was Ahmed Pasha al-Jeza, known as the Butcher. For 25 years, he had ruled Syria with an iron fist and was notorious for his imaginative tortures and executions. He had ignored Napoleon's invitation to surrender, and unknown to Napoleon, 2 British ships of the line had arrived to support him. Napoleon reached Mount Carmel, 12 miles south of Acre, just in time to see the British capturing a coastal column carrying his vital siege guns. Their loss was a massive blow to his hopes for a quick siege. On the 18th of March, the French arrived outside Acre's walls and began digging in. Without their siege guns, defending the city was a massive challenge. Acre, bristled with 250 guns, was surrounded on 3 sides by the sea, and on the other by walls 8 meters thick. The British controlled the sea, ensuring an easy supply line for Acre. They had landed Marines and naval gun crews, and now, ironically, Napoleon's own siege guns, captured earlier, were being used to strengthen the defense. The British commander, Commodore Sir Sidney Smith, was an energetic and resourceful leader. Assisting him was a French Maigre, Antoine de Lipo, a former classmate of Napoleon's, who provided expert advice on siege warfare. 10 days after the French arrived, their bombardment began. Napoleon's field guns managed to open a small breach in the walls, but were quickly overpowered by the defenders' return fire. 40 of his gunners were killed, and all but 3 guns were disabled. Undeterred, Napoleon sent his infantry in with scaling ladders, but a hidden ditch halted their assault, while the defenders rained down musket fire and rocks. The French retreated in disarray. Any man left behind faced a grim fate. The Butcher, the Pasha of Acre, had offered a reward for every French head brought to him. Soon after, the French repulsed an Ottoman sortie, inflicting heavy losses. The siege of Acre settled into a stalemate. Napoleon decided to wait for heavier guns to arrive from Alexandria before risking another assault. But then, alarming news arrived. The Ottoman army gathering in the north, 40,000 strong, was on the move. Napoleon could only spare 4,000 men to face them. The odds seemed impossible. But Napoleon trusted his troops' training, their experience, and especially the quality of his officers. Unsure of the enemy's exact line of advance, he divided his force. On April 8th, at Nazareth, General Junot located and scattered an enemy cavalry force 10 times his own size. 3 days later, General Kleber defeated 5,000 Ottomans at Cana, while Murat surprised another force north of the Sea of Galilee. Then, on the 15th, Kleber received word that the main enemy force had circled south and camped near Mount Hammer, just 8 miles from Mount Table. Seeking glory, Kleber advanced with only his division, aiming to surprise the enemy at dawn. But he misjudged the march. When the sun rose, he found his 1,500 men exposed on open ground, facing 35,000. Kleber's division formed a square. Under a scorching sun, they held the enemy at bay for 10 desperate hours. But their ammunition was running critically low. Meanwhile, Napoleon was racing towards them with 2,500 men. He arrived just in time, attacking the Ottoman army from behind and catching them completely by surprise. Most of the Ottoman force was made up of village militia who, caught in the sudden panic, fled in all directions. Kleber joined the attack, and the Ottoman army simply disintegrated. At a cost of fewer than 300 casualties, Napoleon had destroyed the enemy relief force and secured his control of Palestine. Surely Acre's fall would now follow. But back at Acre, the situation for the French was getting worse. Without control of the sea, they could do nothing to stop supplies and reinforcements from pouring into the city. Their own ammunition reserves were so low that soldiers were sent to collect spent cannonballs to fire back at the defenders. More alarmingly, plague broke out in the French camp, with around 20 new cases every day. Then, a sudden opportunity. On April 24th, the French detonated a mine under one of Acre's towers, causing serious damage. Napoleon ordered an immediate assault. Hundreds of grenadiers charged forward, but once again, they were met with devastating fire and had to fall back. Time was running out for Napoleon. He knew the main Ottoman army gathered at Rhodes would soon make its move, and he dreaded having to cross the Sinai Desert again in the deadly heat of high summer. Finally, on May 7th, Napoleon's replacement siege artillery arrived. Without wasting a moment, the heavy French guns opened fire the next morning. Large sections of the city's battered walls were brought down. French troops assaulted at several points, with some even fighting their way into the city. But fierce counterattacks by British Marines and Turkish troops drove them back. General Lannes was wounded in the neck and had to be dragged to safety, narrowly escaping the Pasha's executioners. On May 10th, Napoleon called upon Kleber's grenadiers to make one final attempt. Nothing could be more beautiful than Kleber on the day of battle, Napoleon later observed, as the general led his division forward with unshakable courage. General Vaughan advanced with his troops in support but was mortally wounded in the fighting. Despite all the French heroism and courage on display, the enemy's firepower, ferocity, and skill proved insurmountable. Napoleon, watching the assault from a forward battery, was knocked off his feet by a near miss. Finally, he accepted that his men had done all that could be asked of them. The attempt to take Acre had failed. This was Napoleon's first major military defeat. The 4-month campaign would cost him 4,500 casualties, more than a third of his army's fighting strength. Nevertheless, Napoleon had achieved his main objective, neutralizing the threat from Syria. On May 20th, his army began the 300-mile march back to Egypt. Along the way, at Jaffa, Napoleon ordered that around 50 of his men, racked with plague and unable to march, be put out of their misery with an overdose of laudanum. These were mercy killings. The men would have suffered a worse fate at enemy hands, but the decision remains controversial to this day. The French retreat continued into the desert. The heat was extreme, and water was scarce. Morale hit rock bottom. Finally, after 25 days of marching, the army reached Cairo on June 14th. Their return was marked by triumphant parades and celebrations throughout the city, all organized by Napoleon himself. He was determined that his campaign be seen as a stunning success, both in Cairo and back in France. The men had only a few weeks to rest. On July 15th, news came that the long-awaited Ottoman invasion had finally begun at There was no time to lose. Napoleon had to strike immediately before the enemy could break out into the Nile Delta. With most of the Cairo garrison, Murat's cavalry, and Kléber's division, 10,000 men in total, he raced towards Abu. The experienced Ottoman commander, Said Mustafa Pasha, had 9,000 men dug in behind two defensive lines guarding Abu Khair castle. His plan was to force the French to attack his strong defenses. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this look into Napoleon's campaign, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more chapters from history. See you next time. Napoleon was delighted when he learned this. The enemy had nowhere to run. At dawn on the 25th of July, he ordered a full attack. The first Ottoman defensive line wasn't completed and was overrun in minutes. French cavalry swept around to cut off the Ottoman right wing. Trapped against the sea, the defenders panicked and fled into the water, hoping to reach ships in the open sea. Thousands drowned, with D'Estaing's division advancing on the left, Lannes in the center, and Murat's cavalry on the right. The French now advanced against the second Ottoman line. Anchored by some redoubts, it resisted the first assault. But when the French pulled back, overconfident Turkish soldiers left their positions to pursue them. Murat seized the moment and charged forward with his cavalry. The second line was overrun. Murat pushed on into the Ottoman camp and, despite a gunshot wound to the face, captured Mustafa Pasha at sword point. By 1 p.m., the Turkish army had ceased to exist. Only 5,000 survivors remained, trapped in the castle. They surrendered 8 days later, on the 2nd of August, 1 year after the destruction of Napoleon's fleet. The Battle of Abu Khair was a great victory for Napoleon and did much to restore his reputation after the defeat at Acre. But now came news of developments in Europe. And for France, the news wasn't good. A new second coalition had formed against France, led by Britain, Russia, and Austria. Their armies had won a series of battles against the French, reversing almost all of Napoleon's achievements in Italy, and now threatened the Republic with invasion. This was no time for France's greatest general to be far from home, unable to influence events. La Patrie was in danger. Napoleon's next move was not in doubt. On the evening of the 23rd of August, Napoleon quietly boarded a frigate near Alexandria, with a small entourage including Berthier, Marmont, Lannes, and Murat, and sailed for France. To his army, he left only a brief proclamation. The news from Europe had decided me to go to France. I leave command of the army to General Kleber. The army will hear from me immediately. For the moment, I can say no more. It pains me greatly to leave troops to whom I am so attached. General Kleber was not pleased with his sudden promotion. "He has abandoned us with his britches full of shit," he declared. "When we get back to Europe, we'll rub his face in it." But Kleber would never return to Europe. The following summer, he was stabbed to death by a young Muslim radical. Later repatriated by the Royal Navy under the terms of a peace treaty, Napoleon's Egyptian expedition had been a costly failure for France. Unclear and opportunistic, it became impossible after the destruction of the French fleet at Abu. The expedition did have one positive legacy. Shortly before departing for France, Napoleon was invited to inspect a stone slab his troops had uncovered from the ruins whilst building a fort near the town of Rosetta. Dating from the 2nd century before our era, the slab was inscribed with a royal decree. Uniquely, the same text appeared in ancient Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. The French had to surrender it to the British under the terms of their capitulation. So the Rosetta Stone now resides in the British Museum. 2 decades after its rediscovery, the stone proved key to unlocking the lost language of Egyptian hieroglyphics and revolutionizing the study of ancient Egypt. This and other discoveries by the French savants brought forth an entirely new discipline: Egyptology, the study of Egypt's distant past, which continues to captivate and amaze us to this day. Napoleon's journey across the Mediterranean took 41 days and included several close calls with the Royal Navy. But his luck wasn't to be thwarted a second time. Along the way, he made his final visit to Corsica and his birthplace, before heading to France, to take the next step in his stunning rise to power. Now, I've got to ask, do you think AI is improving the quality of videos you're seeing online? Or quite the opposite? Perhaps, like us, you've noticed a flood of new documentaries with derivative scripts, robotic narration, and wildly inaccurate imagery. At Epic History, we've always used and promised to continue using a team of skilled humans to ensure everything we create is trustworthy and authentic, from research to scripts, animation, and I've been assured, narration. So, if you're tired of sifting through questionable AI-generated content just to find something worth watching, then perhaps it's time to turn to the prestigious Nebula streaming service, where you'll find only high-quality, human-created videos. Nebula is a streaming service built by creators to offer a superior experience to other video platforms. Here, there are no ads, just hand-picked creators you can trust, working hard to create original and thoughtful content. For now, it's the most interesting and fastest-growing independent video platform on the internet. And because Nebula fairly rewards its creators, your subscription actively supports channels like ours as we strive to create ever more ambitious historical content. There are hundreds of great creators on Nebula across all genres, so whatever your interests, you're guaranteed to find something you'll love. From original films and podcasts, to documentaries covering everything from science and engineering, to film and television, and of course, history. The History homepage shows just how much Nebula has to offer, including Nebula Originals available only to subscribers. This ever-growing list of exclusive content includes Real Life Lore's massive Modern Conflicts series, which most recently explores the 7th of October attacks hour by hour in accurate detail. Remember, thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!